What's up, class? So, in Washington state history, the Pig War is possibly the greatest war that never was. And while this porcine imbroglio occurred in 1859, the same year Oregon became a state, the actual story, the background, begins much earlier in 1846, 1 year before the Whitman Massacre. So, remember that England had a pretty good claim to the land that we now call Washington State. They had Fort Vancouver. They had the first major city. The Hudson's Bay Company was British, and they controlled the Columbia River. And so England actually claimed everything that was north of the Columbia River to be England. And so if they would have got their way, we'd be speaking with British accents right now, or maybe Canadian accents, eh? But American settlers continued to pour in across the Oregon Trail anyway. And so by 1846, it was pretty much apparent that this was going to be part of America. And England went to the negotiating table and they decided that everything up here, like what is today Canada, would be part of England, and that America would be down here, and they would be separated by these waterways. The Strait of Juan de Fuca, this waterway, and the Strait of Georgia up here, this waterway. But that left these islands, these border islands, in dispute. So in 1846, there was still some uncertainty about the geography of the region. And people disagreed. Were these islands American or were they British? So British and American politicians met again 10 years later in 1856, and they tried to hammer out a negotiation for who would control these islands, and they couldn't come to an agreement. And so both sides left claiming ownership of the westernmost San Juan Islands. So that was 1856. In 1859, an American named Lyman Cutler, that may or may not be an actual photograph of him, Lyman Cutler, a potato farmer, moved to the San Juan Islands to try his hand at farming potatoes. And if you know anything about farming potatoes, which you should since you're all going to be sputters, you would know that it is back-breaking, dirty work, and especially up north where the ground is hard. So Lyman Cutler's trying to, feed himself and maybe his family, and one day he finds this large black pig rooting around in his garden, eating his potato crop. So what does the American farmer Lyman Cutler do? Lyman Cutler was so upset about losing his crops that he aimed his gun and he shoots the pig dead. Well, that pig was owned by a guy named Charles Griffin. And Charles Griffin was an Irishman who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. So he's a fur trader and he's a British subject. And so when Lyman Cutler killed his pig, he offered to compensate him, right, for killing his pig. He offered this Irishman $10 to pay for his dead pig, which was probably a fair price in those days. But Griffin demanded $100, which was a lot of money back then. Something like between $3,000 and $4,000. And it was more than what Lyman Cutler was able to pay. And so this created a conflict, because who would decide their case? According to Charles Griffin, that island was part of England, and the case should be decided by the Crown. And according to Lyman Cutler, they were in America, and an American judge should decide the case. And so this led to conflict. And the conflict escalated. And it became an international issue because all of the English people living on the island, they called England in to settle the dispute, and the Americans living on the island called in the Americans. Was it British or was it American? So 66 American soldiers are called in over this stupid pig. And the British sent in 3 full-blown warships from their navy. And so by August of that year, they kept building up troops. There were nearly 500 American soldiers with 14 cannon facing 5 British warships, mounting 70 guns. These are like battleship guns, carrying 2,140 men. We're about to have a world war between England, the most powerful country in the world, and the United States, all over a pig. And so Washington, this area is pretty far away from the center of the British Empire. And it took a little bit for the news of all of this armed conflict to reach back home. And so when it finally did reach Washington, D.C. and London, England, it shows up in the papers. Everyone is shocked that we're on the verge of this major war over one dead pig. So that brought everybody together back to the negotiating table, and diplomats were able to work out a compromise. What they agreed to do instead of total war over a pig was to jointly occupy the San Juan Island. So they would be controlled both by the British and by Americans. And both sides promised to only install a small military force. So neither side would have more than 100 men on each side, so they couldn't keep escalating all of that power struggle there. And it's kind of an interesting chapter in history because over the next few years, British and Americans both had a base on the same island, and they shared it peacefully. And they played softball together and other sports together, and really started this long tradition of the British military and the American military being allies and friends. And the British, they finally evacuated all of their troops from the island in 1872, giving America full sovereignty over the San Juan Islands. So, this pig war, Washington's greatest war that never was, played a very important role in the eventual shape of Washington state, adding some of the most unique and beautiful physical features of our state, the San Juan Islands. Thanks.